Welcome. I'd like to give a very warm welcome to all of you who are joining us both in person as well as online through our Facebook page, FreeLand Film Festival. We're so honored that you can join with us today. And as we know what we're living through right now, we do not take this for granted, the ability to gather, to share stories, to learn from each other. So you are joining us here today at the 4th Annual FreeLand Film Festival. This year's theme is A Better World Beyond Pandemics. I am the moderator. I'm honored to be a moderator today with two incredible women, two National Geographic explorers, alumna of the TED Talk. I encourage you to Google them afterwards and find out more about them. And so I'd like to begin first by setting the tone for where we are right now after watching this film. And welcome, Juliana. We can now view you on the big screen. We're so glad you are joining us from Brazil. So, in fact, I should say, I will give a more in-depth biography of these two incredible women, but I will acknowledge right now that I'm honored to be sitting next to you, Onkuri Majumdar. Thank you, Onkuri, for joining us here in person.
Thanks for having me here.
And actually, you are in Thailand, so we're so honored to have you here in Green Lake, Wisconsin.
Yeah, it was quite a trip, but we made it.
And joining us on the big screen, all the way in Brazil, Dr. Juliana Machado Ferreira. Glad you can have us. Glad you can be here with us. So first, I would like to
be here.
Oh, yes. First, I would like to recognize and do a land acknowledgement. I would like to recognize the 12 First Nations that reside in the boundaries of the state of Wisconsin, which of course where we are in person right now filming this discussion from. Among them, the nations of Ho-Chunk, Potawatomi, Ojibwa, Menominee, Mohican, Oneida, and Brothertown. Collectively, we honor their history of resistance and resilience to give us a sacred space to share with you here today. And so to the audience, and for anyone watching, here's my plug that come next year to FreeLand Film Festival in Green Lake, Wisconsin. We strive to not just have an experience where you sit back and enjoy good films and discussions, but that you get to participate. You yourself get to ask questions, engage with leaders. And so I'm going to be asking the audience what stood out for you in the film. But a quick recap for those that may be joining online and did not have the privilege of watching the film that we just watched known as The Return. Let me just briefly recap that by saying The Return is directed by the indigenous filmmaker Eroboto Gwalinga and co-produced by his niece, the environmental defender Nina Gwalinga, both from Sarayaku, a village in Ecuador, alongside British filmmaker Mark Silver. And so it is described here as, while millions of people around the world have been forced into lockdown amid the coronavirus crisis, a family in the Ecuadorian Amazon has opted to move deeper into the relative safety of the jungle as they reconnect with dormant ancestral knowledge away from the distractions of modern life. Their affinity with nature begins to flourish. As news spreads that Ecuador might lift lockdown soon, will the family stay? And it's pertinent to say, because this is happening now, maybe it's, or will the family go back to the jungle? What will happen next? I'm struck by the fact that this film was talking about something that is happening now. Okay, so audience, here's your part. This might help inform our discussion. Our plan is that this is going to be organic in nature. We can build off of each other. And so before I ask our discussionists what stood out for them, let's hear from the audience. Go ahead. State loudly. Are there certain themes, topics, things that stood out for you that you want to share?
Okay. I think it's really interesting to watch how is the reality in these rural communities in the Amazon network. Sometimes we believe that the Amazon is just animals and we think about tourism. It's really interesting to know how is the real life of this community there. So that was great. I really like that part of the film because it shows how life is there, how different it will be from here in Ecuador.
Thank you. Insightful. We just had an audience member share that it was insightful to hear about a community, a family in the Amazon. That often we think of the Amazon as just being animals and plants, and to hear how they're dealing right now with this pandemic. Thanks so much. And I do believe that comment was from Jose Luis, who is actually from Ecuador, correct? He's shaking his head. From Quito, Ecuador. Jose Luis is a student studying here in Wisconsin. We're so glad to have you here. And perhaps you can provide some more insight and questions as we go. Any other topics that stood out for you? You go ahead, yes.
I was struck by the, sort of going to be emotional for me, but the intergenerational aspect, the importance of several generations. I think that's lost in the U.S. And so I just was struck by family doesn't mean mom, dad, and kids. It's really the multi-generational part of it is pretty powerful.
Thank you for that. The comment from the audience was about the multi-generational aspect and about how a family was defined by more than just the parents and the children, right? That it was larger than that, and perhaps how the family came together. You know, I'm also struck by what we don't see in what was talked about in the film. We don't see a power struggle. We don't see, and perhaps it's there, you know, like any family, but we don't see a concern about status, at least in this film, at least. Well said also that perhaps maybe we have lost some of the multi-generational learning from each other, that emphasis, here in the US at least, and perhaps other places. So, any last comment from the audience, something that they want to bring out and bring to the forefront here that stood out for them? I heard maybe some chatter back here, some comments. I'm also thinking of some folks that have watched this beforehand, talked about near the beginning, it showed that flooding and how the environmental degradation that is affecting communities right now.
I think something important thing is also about the part when the lady said that government has not been helping the communities. So I think, you know, we should think about that. We should do something in order to change that, because, you know, the government should be protecting not just the cities, but also all the country. Every community needs the help of the government. So I think that's something important we have to consider.
Another comment was about the role of the government. What should the government be doing? How we saw in the film, the comment of the government was not providing help, and how they had to rely on other ways, creative ways and knowledge to get help. So great themes here that are being brought up. So now let's turn to our panelists. And so I'd like to hear from both of you what stood out for you. And perhaps actually, before I do that, let me now give a little bit more of your background, because it is quite impressive for both of you women. And so first I will start with Onkuri. Onkuri Majumdar is a managing director of FreeLand India, an organization working to combat wildlife trafficking in South Asia. She is one of FreeLand's lead analysts on wildlife trafficking and has been featured on National Geographic's Crimes Against Nature. Onkuri always knew she would work with animals and has devoured information from the natural world since childhood. Today, she is part of a group of organizations which support governments across the world to end wildlife trafficking. The illegal trade in wild animals is among the largest international, transnational organized crimes, earning staggering profits with very low investments for traffickers. Paying the price are voiceless, voteless animals, as well as people who depend on forests, rivers, and ecosystem services. Her work has involved training police, forest, and customs agencies. She's done TV programs and supported enforcement action against traffickers. In 2013, she was selected as a worldwide emerging wildlife conservation leader. 2015, she was chosen as an emerging explorer by National Geographic. And just this year, she was named to the Explorers 50 by the Explorers Club, an annual recognition to recognize the world's top 50 trailblazers in science, conservation, and more. In addition, I hear that you speak Bengali, Hindi, and Thai, and of course English. And her areas of expertise include wildlife crime, law enforcement, law and legislation, and wildlife trafficking. Whew, and I could go on and on. Thank you so much for joining us today. In fact, why don't you join me in giving a round of applause. So why don't we stick with you, Onkuri? We're going to get to you, Dr. Juliana. But first tell us, Onkuri, what stood out for you from this film? What are some themes that perhaps really hit you personally, but also related to your work?
Well, I think part of my work is always trying to see what's behind the picture, what's not so obvious, and always stepping back to see, like, what am I not seeing when you look at what's being shown to you. So I think what really struck me is, okay, we're looking at this film which involves filmmakers from the external world going into this very small, apparently insular community. And I'm sure they took all the correct precautions, and I'm sure they took all the medical precautions they could. But it's a sign that nobody is as insular or as isolated or as independent as we like to think we might be. There's always contact. I mean, even among the community elders we saw in the movie, the elder lady, she was talking about dreaming about an octopus, which is a creature she had never seen in real life but only watched in films. So through our stories, through movies, through the stories we tell about ourselves and to ourselves, we are connected to each other. And maybe we are very far away from that first domino that falls. Maybe we're right at the end. But eventually it all links up, and that's what really struck me.
So much there. And again, how we are interconnected. Thank you for that, Onkuri. Dr. Juliana Machado Ferreira, again, thank you for joining us from Brazil. And she is the founder and executive director of FreeLand Brazil, the South American branch of FreeLand Global. Brazilian-born and passionate about nature and all living things since she was a child, Dr. Juliana holds a degree in biological sciences with a master's and PhD in biology, genetics from the University of Sao Paulo. She has volunteered for the CWT organization SOS Fauna from 2007 to 2013. She also volunteered and later developed her PhD in collaboration with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Forensics Laboratory from 2005 to 2013. She's a TED Fellow from 2009. She was a TED Speaker in 2010 and then became a TED Senior Fellow from 2010 to 2012, as well as a Nat Geo Emerging Explorer in 2014. She received the Wings World Quest Courage Award in 2016. This supports extraordinary women making extreme discoveries in science and exploration. Juliana is a founding member and executive director of FreeLand Brazil since 2012. And FreeLand Brazil is, of course, the South American branch of FreeLand, the organization that is sponsoring FreeLand Film Festival here today. Currently, Juliana is a coordinator of a counter wildlife trafficking in Brazil project in collaboration with WWF Brazil and is sponsored by the INL. She is part of the steering group to End Wildlife Crime Initiative and is the mother of an adorable 7-year-old. Who just had dinner, I'm told, before you came on and joined us here tonight. I do want to mention real quick that Juliana uses a comprehensive approach to her work. Maybe this helped guide some of our questions for her later. She combines scientific research, education and awareness, and public policy based on 3 pillars. 1, education and awareness to reduce demand for wildlife in parts and products. 2, research development of tools and capacity building to support law enforcement. And 3, public policy and international articulation to institutionalize and combat wildlife trafficking. Again, join me in another round of applause for Dr. Juliana.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here, even if it's remotely.
So same question for you, Dr. Juliana. What stood out for you? What hit you both personally as well as professionally in your work? And I do want to take note that after you watched that film, you wrote to me how that struck you. Could you share that with the audience for all of us to hear?
Yes, several things caught my attention. One is that although it is a cliche, indigenous lands are so important for conservation. And there are studies, there is a study in Brazil showing how indigenous lands are the ones which lost less standing forests, had less percentage of deforestation. So they are important not only to keep the indigenous peoples and their traditions and cultures, but all the ecological services and the ecosystem functioning. So this is very important. I also think that we shouldn't romanticize, if that's a word in English, life in the forest. It's not easy, it's challenging, it's difficult. You have to, so I think that sometimes we see these movies and we think, oh, let's go into the wild, which is the name of another movie, in which a boy goes to Alaska and it doesn't end so well. So although I think it's beautiful that they were seeking a safer place in the forest, and that's their home, we can't all of us go into the forest, into the wild, and start living like indigenous peoples. But we can do other things. Indigenous lands are now under attack from mining companies, agricultural practices, logging industry, both legal and illegal. And also, we need to stop this disconnection. So we all watch that and we think it's beautiful. And then we go about with our lives, changing our cell phones every year without considering where these minerals come from and other things. So I know it's a bunch of things, but the movie really touched me. So I think it was beautiful and powerful. And when I saw it and I looked around and I saw my car and my cell phone, it seemed meaningless. But then I thought, we can't all of us just go back to what indigenous peoples were before. But at the same time, sometimes we try to reconnect with nature and we do the wrong way. We do detrimental things, like doing wildlife tourism and taking pictures with wild animals, which is really horrible, has lots of negative effects, or keeping exotic pets, which can be another kind of problem, and get in contact with all the potential sources of zoonosis. So I think that the movie brings a lot of food for thought and reflections about how we are confusing our sense of freedom with fulfilling our desires. It's my freedom to own an exotic pet, or it's just a desire I want to fulfill? It's my freedom to change my cell phone every year, or it's just a desire I want to fulfill? So what is our connection with nature? What is our duty? What is our duty with indigenous peoples and tribes? I thought it was really powerful.
There are so many topics there. And again, for those of you in the audience, feel free to jump in because you're a part of this discussion and this experience together. I will also say to both panelists, if something strikes you that each other says, feel free to jump in because this again is meant to be building off of each other. There's so many places we can go from now. Almost to perhaps help us organize what to talk about next, I thought about looking at our FreeLand mission, which is, of course, to protect vulnerable people, wildlife, and ecosystems. And maybe let's start with the first tenet of protecting vulnerable people. Onkuri, when we talked, you had said that there's a lot about indigenous culture and in your experience working in India that perhaps you wanted to touch on what this brought up. Now, we'll also note that the filmmaker is himself indigenous, but you have some experiences perhaps where that may not be the case. Is there anything more that you want to touch on relating to protecting vulnerable people?
Yeah, so I think, Juliana, I agree with you, this whole idea of romanticizing the return to nature. And I think it's definitely a remnant of a very colonial mindset of the noble savage leading the noble and pure life, while all of us depraved city dwellers have forgotten how to return to nature. The thing is, human beings can be good or bad, whether you're sitting in a stockbroker's office or you're living in the Amazonian rainforest. Now, nobody, last of all me, can deny how much work indigenous communities have done to protect our natural reserves. And similar to what Juliana was mentioning in Brazil, there are so many cases like that in India where traditional lands are being encroached on by mining companies, by railways, and so on. And always it's powerful government agencies, powerful private corporations, very often with powerful media backing, against these indigenous communities. But also at the same time, from my previous work in India, there are certain traditional communities in India, and here I'm speaking specifically of India, not all over the world. And their traditional livelihood is killing big cats. Like, they specialize in leopard hunting, they specialize in tiger hunting, and they supply to middlemen, traffickers, who then supply those skins and other body parts up the supply chain. Now, clearly, that is not an indigenous, traditional occupation that should continue. It just can't. We don't have enough tigers. We don't have enough leopards left in India. We can't say, your ancestors have been specialized tiger killers for the last 2,000 years or 5,000 years, so you should be okay continuing with that. So I think there's a fine balance to be drawn between romanticizing this idea of the noble savage who always does everything right, and understanding there are very nuanced connections between humans and nature, no matter how rich or poor, how developed, or how many resources you have. And it's not a one story that fits all sort of solution or approach that we should be looking at.
The solution.
Yes, here we have.
Yeah. Go ahead,
we
Juliana.
have indigenous peoples who are trying to fight mining in their lands and etc. But also there are those, and I believe they're a minority here, but there are those who wish that. I'm not specialized in that, so I don't want to say anything that may not be accurate. But it's exactly what Onkuri said. It's not one story. It's a myriad of cultures and of life stories and of very specific contexts. So I agree with her.
Yeah, we're doing good so far. We agree with each other.
And it is complicated. I really think it's important that you touched on the fact that, a solution, as you said, it's not just one thing. When we look at how to protect ecosystems, how to protect indigenous culture, to your point, there's different ways and maybe helping certain cultures to understand that there might have to be change that's made. And that gets touchy. Who decides that change? Who decides how that's done? When I talked with you earlier, you talked about some success that you have had and have heard of organizations and how that works to help perhaps some cultures change and help, again, meet the mission of a healthy ecosystem. Is there anything more you want to talk about?
Jolene,
yeah.
I wanted to say something.
Yes.
I think that we keep talking about this decision concerning the indigenous peoples,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that Onkuri said a word that is very important, this colonialist approach.
Mm-hmm.
What we are witnessing here in Brazil is, we have, of course, legislators and government making decisions. I think we have one federal congressman who is from an indigenous tribe. I think we need to give the decision in their hands. They need to be represented. It's not up to us to say what they should or should not do. It's up to them. So I think that this being represented in the government and in the decision-making process is something very important. And another thing that I think we should be discussing here after this film is the return to nature and what this means to people who are not from indigenous communities, and how we are doing this and how detrimental this can be if we don't do the right way.
So let's go there, Juliana. Let's continue following that up. So well said. Let's continue on with that theme. And
I didn't mean to interrupt. I think Onkuri was going to say something.
Well, yeah, I mean, we have to, when we're talking about vulnerable people, indigenous communities, what do you want? And if the answer is we want a road and a school and a hospital, maybe that's not possible to have that right in the middle of the forest. I mean, returning to your question, Jolene, about our discussion yesterday. So this, a little bit of a history lesson here. There were, among these specialized tiger and leopard hunting tribes in India, they are part of a bigger subculture of tribes who, during British Raj times, they were classified as criminal tribes, which is because their traditional occupation included robbing, armed robbery, hunting, and so on. Now, and they were really, really professional about it. Like, little boys would be initiated in how to first pick pockets, and then they would graduate to stealing larger amounts and graduate to murdering. And it sounds really, really politically incorrect to classify a whole group of people as criminal tribes. So obviously, once India gained independence, that kind of classification was done away with. But these communities had been practicing those occupations, and they were very proud of that. It wasn't something they were ashamed of. And so there was a challenge in front of conservationists. Like, we are all educated, mostly with city background people who, why should we go and tell them stop killing tigers? Because that's what you know how to do, that's what you take great pride in. But again, we want people to stop killing tigers. And so I think one of the approaches, people tried lots of approaches. Some of it was, okay, instead of hunting these tigers, why don't you give you a little patch of land that you can work on as a farmer? But things like that usually did not do very well because, again, the pride they took in being specialized tiger killers was so strong. And for them, it was a very, free sort of life, like every tiger that was walking around is essentially a lottery ticket or something in the bank that you just encash at any point of time. Your village needs to have a celebration, you need to buy lots of alcohol, kill a tiger, sell it, get the money, and the next time a village festival happens, you do that again. So for asking people like that to stop that lifestyle where they can just take what they want and use it as they want and exchange it for the back-breaking life of a small farmer, that's just not a very viable option. So then again, the government, some government agencies and conservationists, they started looking at other approaches. So I think one of the approaches that did work, and I personally haven't done this, I'm talking about other people's work, was actually talking to the women in these tribes and saying, look at the kind of life your children are going to lead because they'll always be suspected by law enforcement wherever they go. So that sort of started to change the mindset. So again, we have to really think, we come in with our middle class backgrounds and say, oh my God, these people don't have shoes. Oh my God, they're living without medicines. Oh my God, they're nomadic. Surely they want a home. Surely they want shoes. Surely they want clothes without holes in them. But to them, that didn't matter. For them, the freedom to travel around, kill a tiger or leopard, earn a bit of money, celebrate, travel somewhere else, that resonated with them way more than staying and growing crops on a small patch of land. So you really have to think about the mindset that people are bringing into it and how can you mesh with that and kind of work towards a common goal rather than saying, you are wrong, you are evil, and this is what you have to do.
I heard some claps. Yes,
so
well
here
said.
Here in Brazil, there's a couple of indigenous thinkers, and they try to convey to other people how they see the world differently in their views. So one of the tribes or communities, I'm not sure what's the best term to use in English, they have this story that if they take what they shouldn't, then the skies are gonna fall on our heads, and they are. And what they say, I'm reading a book about by one of them, and they say that they think we are sick because we need and put importance in things that are not important. So they say, you come here, Onkuri said, surely they want shoes, surely, maybe they don't. And maybe, and they see us as sick spirits because we rely our happiness on things that are gonna make the skies fall on our heads. So I think it's beautiful also to try to see the world through their eyes and their logic, and they're like, I don't want the life you're living. I don't want what you're doing. So I think that's interesting too.
And I think this plays really well into what I understand that's really special and beneficial about FreeLand is that my guess is in your work, both of you professionally, you've seen a lot of organizations, people coming in wanting to quote unquote help. And can you perhaps speak a little bit more about how FreeLand or how you feel that the work that you do is different in that perhaps it's getting to know the local, it's building those relationships, I know, with local folks, and I know both of you have worked with local law enforcement, scientists, again, training individuals. Perhaps talk a little bit more about the importance of those relationships, how you build that, what you've seen as some of those successes.
Yeah, I mean, do you want us to think of local law enforcement as a local indigenous community? Not in that sense, but I mean, I would say it's a sort of weird little world that local law enforcement works in, because usually they are from those semi-rural areas which are near protected areas. Usually they're not very connected with their superiors who are sitting in the capital city of the country. But they are sent to implement laws which they may not always 100% believe in, because they are from the communities which are technically violating those laws. So yeah, when we start training them, a lot of it is just teaching them basics of, you know, how to patrol effectively, how to carry out a good investigation. But a lot of it is also looking at what are your needs. Okay, you're from this tribe. How do you go back and talk to your tribe about this? What do your elders say about this? And then not during the training itself, but usually after the day's training is over, they come and tell you their stories like, you know, I come from this tribe and I was hired into this service and I see this is bad, but how do I tell people in my family that this is bad? So this is just an ongoing conversation. There's no simple solution to that.
There isn't, and that's how we continue these conversations. Yes, Dr. Juliana.
No, it's okay. I have a different experience because I'm not so much on the ground in rural areas right now. I did that back in my PhD. But I think, I'm not sure about the laws of other countries, but in Brazil, the indigenous communities, they are guaranteed that all the activities that pertain to their culture are lawful. So, for example, hunting animals for their consumption or rituals, it's not unlawful. What is unlawful is to sell, or as Onkuri said, I think that one thing is a tribe that hunts an animal and it may be a protected species. Another thing is when they start selling to a demand, which is, for example, mainly in the city, and then we increase volume and we escalate, and that is where the problem lies, I think. But I think that what I really like about FreeLand, and I really love working for FreeLand and at FreeLand, is that we are good listeners. What made me fall in love is that it's an organization with very high technical expertise, but every time we're gonna do something, and I learned that from Onkuri, from Steve and others, is we first listen. How can we collaborate? What this community needs or what this governmental agency needs. We don't go there with a package saying this is what you need, law enforcement. We listen. What do you need? What is your perceived gaps? Where do you feel that you could use some collaboration from people from the civil society? And this is why we have such good working relationships. My grandpa used to say, we have 2 ears to hear the double than what we speak from one mouth. So I really like FreeLand because of that. When I started this project in Brazil, the first thing Steve told me was, you need to hear from the governmental agencies what they need. So I think this is something that I consider very, very special of the organization. Not all organizations do that.
Yeah, I mean, that's been our main thing. The first thing before we go and do a training course or anything like that, a conference, a seminar in any area, we first say, what do you need? This is our typical package. which modules do you want to keep? Do you want us to add more modules? For example, in India, now the Indian Wildlife Act is really, really strong. So, actually, forest officers and even police officers have lots of powers to investigate wildlife crime. Where things fail is in prosecution, because most prosecution in India still relies on human witnesses. And cases take so long so people can get transferred out, they can be bribed, or whatever. So when we heard that this was a main problem, then we started really focusing on how to present yourself in court. Because again, a lot of the junior enforcement officials, they don't come from very slick backgrounds. So to be faced with a defense attorney who's cross-examining them pretty harshly would really rattle them. Like, even if they've done a case very well, they just couldn't answer. So we started building in this how to face hostile cross-examination as part of our training course in India. And I mean, it's great fun because we have a lawyer. She's a great litigator, great cross-examiner. And we divide the trainees into teams, and we have them create a case and send someone up to present the case as if actually before a magistrate. And then our lawyer, she grills them. And it's funny because obviously they all know this is a mock act. They know it's not real. But you can actually see them start sweating and getting really aggressive. And, so at one time we were at this Kaziranga tiger reserve, which is a really famous Indian rhino habitat. We were doing a training there. So one poor young guy came up to be interrogated, and our lawyer was like, "Oh, tell me about how long have you been in the Forest Service?" "So many years." "And what did your father do?" "He was also in the Forest Service." "For how many years?" 20 years. "Oh, so your family's been stealing Forest Department money for 40 years now." And, you could see him getting really rattled, but these are the kind of questions they face. So if they can't handle it in a mock setting, they're not going to be able to handle it in real life, and that's why prosecution cases very often fail. So we really try to talk to them, get to know what they want. Again, in India, one question we ask them, so is there something we missed? Is there something you would like to learn from us that wasn't part of our modules? They said, how do we avoid sloth bear attacks? Because sloth bears are notoriously bad-tempered. And I still don't know. I don't know what to tell him then. I still don't know how to tell someone how to avoid a sloth bear attack, other than don't be in the way of a sloth bear. We don't have all the answers, but we try to learn from them also.
I think it's really interesting that work that you're involved in, again, helping to train the individuals and so that they can represent appropriately and hopefully win cases and lock up the criminals. Yeah. Can you give us maybe behind the scenes a little bit more about the relationships with local government? Is there a good working relationship? My guess is in some regards, perhaps they're a little bit scared of, if there's corruption, what are you going to find out? What will this mean for our government? Other governments may say, this is really good. We need to, again, sort of root out this corruption. Can you give a little bit more about the connection that you find with local governments, or even perhaps how funding comes in and how this works?
Yeah, so I would say in any typical audience that we're talking to, whether it's a training, whether it's a conference, on average, maybe 10% people are super corrupt, like they will not do anything unless paid money. 10% are super honest, like they will never even use their government-issued car to ever go to the ATM because it's only from work to home, home to work, and they stick to that. But most people are kind of on the spectrum. Usually, if they see that you've come with good intentions and you're not trying to make trouble for them and you're actually doing something that helps them, they'll be open to it. And especially because the first approach we make is slightly senior officials to get the permissions and all. I've seen a lot of them care very much for the fact that their juniors don't have enough insurance money when they're injured, they don't have good support. And quite often I've even heard, our state luckily is well funded, we can give them a lot of things, but they're just so unexposed. So could you sponsor like a training trip somewhere for them, just so they get more exposure to the world? And that's a good reward for them. So I think that's nice that a lot of middle-level managers I meet are really looking out for their juniors. Not always, but quite often. And again, I think that first conversation you have, what do you need? What can we do to help? That's what really sets the tone.
A good reminder, again, coming in with that learning attitude, going back to listening and how FreeLand does a good job of listening.
Yeah.
Juliana, is there anything more you want to say related to sort of perhaps relationships you've seen? Otherwise, I know, a question I had, you work a lot with data and research, and in your past you've had, as far as going back to working with indigenous cultures, I know often, data sets are not representative of indigenous cultures, of minority populations, anything like that. Is there any way, again, I'm kind of opening it up to you, if there's any part of this that you'd like to expound on more?
Yeah, there's a lot of things there. But of course, in order to do any strategic planning that is going to be effective, we need to base on data. Not on guesses, not on what we want things to be, not on beliefs. And when we don't have that, it can be about indigenous peoples, it can be about the amount of animals traded illegally or legally, then we are guesstimating. And then it's difficult to develop any actions that are going to be really effective. So I think that anything that we want to do, we need to first understand, and this is something I talk about a lot with governmental agencies, etc., that we need to have really good data, and people need to know how to register data. Data needs to be consolidated so we can analyze and then build things, strategic planning and actions that are going to be effective. But I'm not sure if that's what you asked.
But it was still interesting. No, it is, exactly. And basically, I want to draw out based on, you both are doing such incredible work. And I think, for me at least, living here in Wisconsin, it's almost hard to wrap my head around the extreme issues that are being faced by our ecosystem, by wildlife. Maybe let's go to wildlife right now. I know both of you wanted to talk more about wildlife trafficking, and perhaps we could go back to you, Juliana, about how your point of how people want to do good and how we want to perhaps connect back with nature, and some issues that you've seen with wildlife tourism, etc. I know that's a passionate area of yours.
It is, and it's something that draws people to love me and to hate me equally. But again, I think that's a great connection with your previous question, because when I say the things I'm about to say, I'm not judging anyone individually. I'm not saying that individual is a bad person and they don't love their pet. What I'm doing is going to the moon and looking down on a set of available data and seeing patterns. So what we are seeing now is that lots of people, we have a bunch of people who are making profits out of wildlife trafficking. This is criminal organization, and this is a share of people that are not what I'm talking about right now. But there are a lot of good people, and they want this connection with nature, and sometimes they will do things that they don't see that as harmful, but they are. So for example, when you go in the Amazon and you take pictures with a sloth or a monkey, this is highly detrimental. For example, this industry usually exploits minors. They have a very high turnover of animals because animals usually die and they have to capture and get others. The animals have violations of welfare, they're not fed properly. Actually what they do, holding these animals so people can take pictures, many times is illegal. And of course, if there is a high turnover and it's a legal activity, these animals are wild caught, they are a potential source of zoonosis as well. And then the more difficult field is the exotic pets. So there is a legal industry of exotic pets and an illegal industry of exotic pets. One is controlled a little bit and the other one is completely uncontrolled. And I do believe people can love their exotic pet, or at least believe they love their exotic pet. However, first, the reasons why people justify this industry is because it's economic, interesting. It's an important industry. But then it takes, one virus, one pathogen to destroy this industry. Of course, I'm not saying that the pandemics came from illegal exotic pets, but what I'm saying is every animal of wild species is a potential source of zoonosis. And what we see when we go to the moon and look at the data is that the way we are doing now, there is a very big leakage of illegal trafficked animals in the legalized supply chain. So even when you buy what you believe is an exotic pet, you may be fueling illegal wildlife trafficking. Also, this generates demand. So we have a singer here, and he has a capuchin. A capuchin in Brazil costs 30,000 reais, that's, I don't know, $6,000 or so. And many people, they don't have this kind of money. And in his Instagram, they say, oh, now I want a capuchin for myself, and they're gonna buy the illegal one. So what is happening is that you want to connect, you want your exotic pet, but then you may be fueling illegal wildlife trafficking, you may be moving pathogens, you may be creating invasive exotic species, etc. So I think we need to rethink, is it really love or a need to possess? And also, why do we need this, and why do we need this industry? And maybe think about what is really freedom and what is just fulfilling desires. We have a social pact. We can't fulfill all of our individual desires, but it's my freedom to own an exotic animal. Man, I have desires that I can't go out and fulfill because we live in a society. And I think it's time we rethink our relationship with the wildlife.
Thank you. Is there more, Onkuri, that you'd like to expound on wildlife trafficking, maybe some things that we are overlooking right now in this conversation related to trafficking and what is happening in our world right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think most people don't realize how big it is and how many species it affects. I think if you asked me which animals are not targeted for the trade, that would be a much shorter answer than which animals are targeted for the trade. Because pretty much everything, like big cats, tigers, leopards, lions, jaguars, cheetahs, everything targeted for their skin, their claws, their whiskers, their penises, everything. You know, when you look at great apes, of course, we have a lot of illegal transport, illegal trafficking of their infants for, again, people who want exotic pets, sometimes for medical research. We're looking at reptiles being sold for consumption, as well as for people who want to keep exotic pets. We're looking at butterfly and beetle collectors. We're looking at people who are collecting marine invertebrates. You know, pretty much every single thing is targeted, either for consumption or because someone wants a pet, or they want a decoration, or they want some sort of item made from the animal. And we don't really stop to think of it, just how pervasive this is. So I think if you're just a member of the general public and not some specialized law enforcement person, what can you do? The main thing is be very aware of what is the source of whatever you're buying, especially if you're a tourist in a foreign country. Maybe it is legal in that particular country, but it may be illegal to cross an international border with it. So the moment you cross an international border, you're liable to prosecution back home. Or maybe it is legal in that country, but that law is based on pressure from a trading lobby rather than what would be good for the conservation of that species. So just don't do it, just say no, basically. And I think this is something that's related not even just to wildlife, but to pretty much everything we consume. Like, who's making the clothes we're wearing? Is it coming from a factory, a company that has a clean supply chain? If you love dark chocolate, where's your dark chocolate being grown and how is it getting to you? Is it a clean supply chain? Similarly, you go to let's say, a seaside town in another country, you see these beautiful shell decorations. What's the supply chain? Very likely it's not clean. Don't do it.
I think it's so well said, and yet it can seem daunting to try to find out where that is. But it reminds me of that's why it's important to perhaps buy local, to know the source. You know, earlier in part of our FreeLand Film Festival, we had a conversation about regenerative agriculture. And I'm reminded about, you know, knowing your local producer, knowing where the products you are consuming are coming from. And so, way to bring that full circle to us right now.
Yeah, and I think one key indicator is if something is priced very cheaply, if it's too good to be true, there's someone being exploited somewhere.
Yeah, I think it's perfect. And I have a very good example, for example, of the Brazilian ipê wood. An ipê deck in the US costs as much as the pinus deck. And an ipê is a threatened species that can grow for more than 1,000 years. And it has been connected to organized crime, lobbying influence, political influence. So ask yourself, I want my ipê deck and I want to pay very little money. The price is gonna be charged somewhere. So we have, if there is one good thing about the market economy that we live in, is the power and responsibility of the consumer. But then I agree with Onkuri 100%. We need to do our part, but I'd like to remind that even if all of us did our parts, if we still have billions of dollars in subsidies to fossil fuels, or to mining in Africa and South America, we hardly are going to change the big picture. So I would like to remind all of us about our responsibilities as voters and as people who really keep an eye on what is being done by politicians, by laws, and also by, you know, all this money that is going to activities that are threatening the life of all of us.
Thank you. A summary for me from what both of you just said is pay attention. Pay attention to what we're consuming, pay attention to around us. I want to open it now up to the audience for questions. And before I do that, I want to go back to the film. I wrote this down, quote it right from the film. It says, and this was from the young man who was featured in the film. He says, "This time has shown us how important it is to be connected with the earth and how much the forest protects and provides for us, not just with food, but also with medicine and balance. The people of the world need to profoundly change their behavior so that we stop harming the earth." That's what you were just talking about, profoundly changing our behavior. And it really hit me because he was talking to me. He was talking to us right here today. And then he goes on to say, "I wonder if the pandemic has made people outside the forest think about this too." So he's talking to us. Now I want to open it back up to the audience and say, are we thinking about things differently right now because of what we're learning, because of this panel, of what we're learning here today in the FreeLand Film Festival and what we're learning from this pandemic? What questions might you have for our incredible panelists here from the audience? Do I see a hand back here?
Yeah, thank you. Onkuri mentioned court cases and training witnesses, and my question was, what do you tell people when they say, "I really want to help, but I'm very nervous about acts of revenge, right, repercussions, and we're dealing here with ruthless syndicates." So how do you go about maybe helping them to move forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, that's what we make central to our strategy when we're teaching them how to collect that evidence. Do not rely on human witnesses. Now, a state witness, as in the investigating officer, that's okay. Typically, they're not threatened so much by wildlife criminals. But if you're calling in someone who happened to, be in a hotel where a trade was being made, or they were just a passerby, or the driver of a vehicle where wildlife was being carried, Yeah, they could be very afraid of that. So what we train them on is don't rely on people. Gather your forensic evidence. We train them on how to do that. Maybe they need tech tools. Maybe they need to be shown how to build that very precise chain of evidence leading from the crime scene to the court. But our central message always is do not rely on people. That's something that works, actually. Because you can't intimidate a piece of physical evidence, it's there. So we just say, don't rely on people.
Thank you. Are there more questions? Yes. Thank you, Rich, a member of the FreeLand board, for bringing the microphone over to our audience member.
Thank you. Okay. My question is, what can we do as an organization, and in my case, as a student, in order to help not only the community, but also the environment, considering all the actions that a lot of companies and organizations they are in the Amazon right now, they are contaminating the Amazon. So what we can do in order to help them, in order to help the community and the environment. I'm a college student, so I would like to know what can I do in order to help.
So I'll throw that to both of our panelists. You've already mentioned a couple of things. Again, pay attention to what we consume, voting, but can you expound a little bit more about, again, what, in this particular case, can a college student, what can any of us do? Are there things more that you want to mention for us? And maybe rolled into this is why we should care.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I heard you correctly. Did you mention something about dams on the Amazon?
I mentioned what we can do
Right.
in order to help the communities and the environment.
Mm-hmm.
Me as a student, that I'm a college student, and also as an organization, what can we do?
Right. See, in terms of large infrastructure projects where a government has made up its mind to do it, I'm going to be frank, it's really difficult to get that government to change its mind. So the only thing that can be done is if you look at national or local laws, like was a proper environment impact assessment done? If your country has something equivalent to the Right to Information or Freedom of Information Act, you can try and get that. I would say make the media your friend, because very often even the smaller news channels are hungry for news that large media organizations may not be interested in. That's if you really want to go the activist path. If you don't want to do that, even just the way you live your life, like I said, don't consume wildlife products. If you see someone consuming wildlife products, it's important to understand why, because, for example, in Asia, when we talk about cultural use of things like rhino horn or elephant ivory, the assumption always was that, oh, these are, old-fashioned beliefs, and they're doing it because their grandmothers taught them to do it. And then it turned out a lot of this consumption was being driven by young men between 25 to 40 because they thought it was cool. Now, if you go and tell someone what you're doing is illegal, they'll think it's even cooler. So there's no point telling them, oh, this is illegal, don't do it. So you have to think of ways of making it really uncool for them. It also depends really from country to country. In some countries, if the government says don't do this, people will obey because they respect the government. In other countries, the moment a government officer says don't do this, they'll be like, yeah, I'm going to do it. Who are you to tell me to stop? So you really have to nuance your approach according to where you live, what the local culture is, what laws are available to you, do you have media support? And sometimes all it takes is to get one person in a position of power interested in your cause, and that one person, because they have that focused interest, they can usually push it through channels much faster than collecting 1,000 signatures. So you just have to look at all these tools and see what you can do.
And I love what you're saying.
I have a couple.
Go ahead.
I have a couple of comments, notes. I think you realized by now that my mind is a little bit of a maze. So bear with me here, because I have all these things inside, and sometimes it's difficult just to convey them. But I think that, for example, for once, working for having open data. So we need to tell the world what's really going on in the Amazon right now. We need to tell the world where the illegal mining is happening. In the past 10 years, we had almost a 500% increase of illegal mining in indigenous lands. And I think that was in Brazil only. So we need to make sure that the world has access to data, to this big infrastructure works, and where are the supporting documents. Who was the lobbyist who pressured the government to have this big infrastructure project? For example, in Brazil, this big infrastructure projects usually are used as a source to repay politicians with illegal money. So it's very important that especially the media, but also people in the academic world can look at this data, analyze this data, and see what's really going on. So I think this is important. Of course, voting. The people who are making these decisions right now are those who we elect. So this is really, really important. And I think it's important to demand consumer countries that they have better control of the supply chains, for example, of the timber. So there is a law enforcement police commissioner here, and he says that for the beef, the European Union requires that we identify each piece of each beef to a single animal, whereas for the timber, the controls are much lighter. So it's interesting if consumer countries such as the USA and European countries had better control of the timber and the logs that you were importing, because a lot of them are illegal. Also, you can educate those close to you. You can have conversations or even have talks in your university or in your school. You can talk to your neighbor, you can talk to a farmer's market. So it's very important to raise awareness about everything that is going on. And frankly, we have been dealing with trying to raise awareness that the climate crisis is a reality. So it's bad enough. We need everyone to help this awareness, to bring awareness to people. And also, my late father, who I really look up to, he used to say that being a true revolutionary in these days is being able to consume less. You know, why we need all these clothes or a new cell phone every year or a new car every 2 years? Or can't you really open your window instead of using the AC? So this is very important too. How much do I consume? What's my impact? And do I really need all these things? And then the big, I would say elephant, but no, the big problem in the room, I would say, you know, if all of us, we don't have to stop, but all of us should consume less, you know, animal protein or animal products. That can have a big impact. You know, we have to get out of our comfort zones. It's not because I want something, I want to buy something and I have this desire that I will for a product or for a food item. I haven't consumed any animal protein for more than 5 years now, and I used to be a competitive swimmer. I'm super healthy, so I'm not saying to all of you, stop eating meat, but maybe decrease a little bit. Maybe look at your consumption habits, and remember that we will require everyone to leave our comfort zones if we want really true change.
You both have given us so many things that I know I'm going to take with me to think about how I might be changed as I move forward. I mean, it's so clear that you're both doing such incredible work, and I'm also struck by we're in the last minutes of this time together. And so as much as it's so clear that you have incredible ideas, you're doing good work, you have lots of energy, I'm also struck by the importance of support that you both need, both from all levels, from governments, from communities, and individuals. And so, because I know you're both so humble, and if I were to just say, you know, tell me more about your current work, I wonder if in the last couple minutes, so that we can hear more about, let's say there was someone that were to give you $20,000 as an example, and they were to say, here's $20,000, what would you put this towards? And I want to hear maybe relate it to your current work. I know that you're both working on some unique projects right now. What would you put that towards? And also sort of as we think about wrapping up our time together, what would you like to share with the audience? Onkuri, I'll go to you first.
So one of the projects I'm working on right now is this smartphone app. It's called WildScan. It's already available online, so you can download it. But what it does is we developed it for frontline people. So let's say a customs officer or an airline official who has to quickly make that decision, is this consignment legal or illegal? And what we found is that a lot of times people were letting it go because they weren't sure and they didn't want to be the one to hold up the whole process. So it's a very simple app. It requires no biological knowledge. You don't have to call in an expert. You just answer 3 or 4 simple questions, and it gives you a list of what potential species it could be, and it takes you to the point where you decide whether it's legal or illegal. Should I let it go? Should I hold the consignment? But once we developed it for frontline officers, we realized actually it's quite useful for everyone. I mean, school children can use it on school trips. You know, if they go to a market where wildlife is being sold, they can use that. Tourists can use it if they go to a country and they see wildlife for sale. So yeah, if someone gave me 20,000, we're expanding the app slowly to cover the whole world. So I would expand it to more regions. I would expand it to most of Asia, more of Africa, South America as well.
Can you say the name of the app again so I can look it up later and download it?
Yeah, it's WildScan, WILDSCAN.
Thank you. Dr. Juliana, I'm sending the same question over to you.
Well, here in Brazil, we are developing a project which has different lines of work, from governance and legal framework to developing capacity, for example, to detect and interdict illegal wildlife crossing our borders, to fomenting transnational coordination against wildlife trafficking. But one thing that it's usually very difficult to fund from our usual funders, which are state grants, for example, is that we lack data on the potential illegal networks that are acting across the Brazilian borders and even with connection with Africa, Asia, the US. And there is a lot of easily available information online, open source, that you don't need any legal authorization to access, but you need knowledge and you need to know how to analyze it. So if I were given this support, I would certainly have an analyst look up to open source information and help us identify the transnational networks that are potentially trafficking our amazing biodiversity.
Yeah, just to add to what Juliana said, this open source information, or OSINT as people in the trade call it, it's really big because now everything is online and so much information is available online. So, you know, even if you don't want to give us 20,000, as Jolene kindly suggested, even if you're a data analyst, student, or an expert, and you want to offer your services just to help us analyze and collate tons and tons of data that's already available online. And once it's crunched down to numbers, we can actually get a much clearer picture of the trade. That kind of in-kind donation, as long as it's very concrete, would be very helpful also.
I'm struck by there's, again, it's just so much that we can take away from this time together. And in our last minute, and I welcome you to please feel free to follow up with me for those in the audience that have additional questions, and I can forward that to our panelists after our time today. It has gone so quickly with you both. It is incredible to be with you. And also, I want to acknowledge, again, that you're both moms. And so it's special that you could spend your time with us. As I think about these complex issues, I often think about how we're able to go out and spread the word, tell our friends, tell our neighbors, tell our children about this. in our closing time, is there anything, this is being recorded, perhaps your daughters one day will go back and see this, that you'd want to share with young people that are listening, perhaps advice for your own daughter? Interestingly enough, yesterday I was in the bookstore just down the road, 10 minutes from here, and they have some books that I actually just brought here. I was so inspired because they have books on Earth by the numbers. Dr. Juliana, being the data scientist, I thought you'd appreciate that. Here's one, Eye to Eye, How Animals See the World. And I just thought, wow, how can I think about ways to maybe, talk with youth about, these books may not cover these complex topics, but there are avenues through our stories of things we're learning, everyday things around us by taking a walk in the woods that we can bring in some of the things that we're learning here today. And so, any last closing thoughts as our time has too quickly come to an end that you both want to share? And maybe, Dr. Juliana, I'll go to you first as you're joining us online.
First, I want to say how grateful and thankful I am to work for these amazing organizations and have people like Onkuri to learn from and have an amazing board to rely on. So I just wanted to express my gratitude and happiness for being able to work with a mission and with amazing people. To answer your question very quickly, I will tell a short story. My daughter is now 7, but when she was 5, she made a drawing. And it was a cage with a bird, an arrow, and a free bird. Mm-hmm. And that's it. She was 5 and she got it. So my dad, again, he used to say that there is only one thing to say, keep them wild. So we need to conserve the natural environment with all its biological processes, interactions, how the natural selection acts on diversity, and it needs environmental change to act upon. So we need to let nature work its processes and species evolve as entities that are dynamic over time, and not just put them in a zoo or in cages. So just show young people that we need wild environments to remain wild, wild animals to remain in the wild. So keep them wild, keep them free.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Yes. And Onkuri.
Yeah, I think particularly because I have a daughter and girls are so socialized to always sort of need to care for everyone else's emotions, even at the cost of their own. And particularly if you're stepping out in the world, as women, you're either not enough or you're too much. So I would teach her, don't wait for permission, don't wait for someone to tell you you are finally good enough, just do it anyways. Oh.
I hope you can both...
This is a powerful panel of 3 women, so yay.
Thank you. Let's please join me in just a round of one big, huge applause for this entire discussion, what we've learned, and for both of you for joining us here today. We're so honored. Let's give it up. Thank you so much. It's an honor and privilege. And thank you for joining us online.